That's one of the things I love about Acts, because it's very real, isn't it? It's a great story, and you hear all these events that are happening. We get into people's lives in many ways, and the ways that we don't normally get when we're reading some of the other letters. I just wanted to tell you a little story I read this week. Do you remember Pope John Paul II? He's a bit of a loss to the world, I think, because he was a groundbreaker in many ways. He certainly changed the Roman Catholic Church, and he would do a lot of travelling, and he wasn't afraid to be amongst the people. And there was a time he was going to visit a hospital. And of course, everyone was getting ready for the VIP visit, and everyone's gone a bit daft. But doctors, of course, being busy, they were running around trying to do their job and trying to get out of the way of people tidying up and everything else. And there was a young doctor who was so busy, had a pile of notes, and he was looking around, and the only chair he could find was a wheelchair. So he sat down in his wheelchair, and he got stuck into what he was doing. And he was so busy that he didn't notice the commotion as the Pope arrived. And he carried on working. And the Pope walked in, and he put his hand on his head, and he blessed him, and he walked away. At that, the doctor stood up and walked. And the people in his entourage went, "Oh, no, no." Now, as funny as that seems, it makes perfect sense to us what actually happened in that instance, because we can work out, because we know the story. But the fact is that God's ways are often planned different to our ways. We plan and we think about the potential of an idea, maybe an event, and then we gather our materials and then we set out to fulfill the plan. And this, of course, makes logical sense because we really want to be good stewards. But we have to understand that we cannot confine God to this kind of thinking. And I think it was Michelangelo who illustrated well the thinking that we should adopt. When he was in his studio one day and a friend walked in and he saw a piece of marble sitting in the corner. He said, "What are you going to do with this?" And he said, "Nothing." He said, "There's an angel in there who needs to get out, and I'm going to release him." I think we have to understand, we have to get that perspective in our lives, so we give God his place so that we can listen to what he wants us to do and to be. Now, the church here in Acts have been making some fantastic strides, and we saw last time how once the racial barriers came down, believers began to get it that God has got plans for everyone who will trust him. And we saw that their hearts were opened and the Holy Spirit came in, and the result was this generosity of spirit as the famine was announced, and they were open-handed and they sent money to help the believers in Judea. So here's your first heading this morning. Oh, no, sorry, it's not. No, okay. So what I wanted to say, sorry, I've missed that. But what I wanted to say is that Augustine said this: where your pleasure is, there is your treasure. Where your treasure is, there is your heart. Where your heart is, there is your happiness. In other words, do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going. Okay. For the early church, all of this joy, all of the feel-good factor they were experiencing was more than froth. It was the reality of God in their midst in the face of some very difficult times. And here is your first heading. They were baying for blood. Everyone around them was baying for their blood. In Acts chapter 12, we've got our Bibles. Let's look at that together, shall we? In verse 1, it was about this time that King Herod had some who belonged to the church arrested them and intended to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. And when he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. Now this happened during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. Now, humanly speaking, it is really hard to fathom the persecution of Jesus and the church in whatever age. It's easy to reason that in a religious sense, the authorities felt exposed and offended. It's easy to reason out that culturally, the Christian refusal to take part in idol worship, for example, it was undermining the cultural norm of placing value on women and on slaves. And that was viewed as being politically subversive. But what they were doing actually was just forming a community. They were feeding the hungry. They were healing the sick. They were helping everyone to understand that God accepts us all on level ground. And what they were doing was creating an issue in a hierarchical society that depended on the have-nots knowing their place. Do you sense a deja vu going on here? As our political philosophies that are active today in our own society would love to assert that hierarchical system again. I don't know if anyone watches Question Time. Does anyone watch that at all? I mean, it's getting poor as it's going on. I have to say, over the years, I've noticed the quality has gone down and down and down and down. But there's always the conservative whipping boy or girl who has to come in, because at the moment the government's not doing too well, everyone's got a complaint, and so they send in someone who's going to get a good whipping. Okay, you know that's going to happen. But what I find incredible, actually with politicians across the board, but in particular with some of the Conservative MPs at the moment, they know what is being said is valid, but the look that they give is this supercilious look and saying, as if to say, you know nothing. And that is where these people were. You know nothing. The truth is that we'll never be able to understand the opposition to Jesus and the gospel from a human perspective. The offense of the gospel has at its root our sin, that independent spirit that just wants to hear only what is palatable for you. And don't you be fooled by those who offer reasoned arguments of the non-existence of God, or those that try to anthropomorphize God and bring him down to a human level of understanding, so that the Creator is bound to the restraints of the created. Do you know, I can't count the number of times in the churches, in the church buildings that I've worshipped in, people coming through the door who have got a history with the church, with that particular church group. And they come and talk about their parents and their grandparents who were members of that church, who were founder members, and they tell you all these great stories. And they tell you about how they were brought up in the church and how they were baptized and they went public with their faith. They didn't go to church anymore. All these prodigals, they don't go to church, they don't know if they really believe, although they believe in something. And then it's really tragic as I pose to them the questions. I make an invitation to come along. But the sticking point for everyone is always Jesus. What are you going to do with Jesus? It's the idea of commitment, you see, which they know will demand a change in their life. They know it will require identifying with the church. They know it will affect the social circles and the image that they've cultivated for so long. And the question has to be to these folk, is hell worth it? The nature of this resistance, you know, it's as old as the day is long. It's thought in this context that James, one of the sons of thunder, had been outspoken, possibly against Herod, issuing a challenge of faith, and the result was he lost his head. Herod was seeing a wave of popularity coming as he saw the Jews were pleased, and he decides he's going to take Peter as well. And then he's got all these plans, and when he's going to make this public display of persecuting these people. But I don't know about you, but I think that is really, really perverse. An oppressed people, the Jews, who were struggling for an identity, national and religious, who have seen so much injustice under the boot of Rome, and now they are baying for the blood of those who challenge the same oppression. Image, our way or no way. You see, pride has got a stench of death about it. Well, they were baying for blood. Secondly, question, securing change? You know, Herod was obviously worried about something. 16 soldiers are detailed round the clock to guard Peter. And this is an indication that the church was growing, and there was a fear that there might be some kind of uprising. Now, Peter probably thought this was curtains. Okay, I think he was probably quite depressed. But at least beheading was going to be a quick death. And I say all this because there's no record of him sharing his faith with his jailers. Unlike Paul and Silas, who in Acts 16, we'll see, actually was speaking to them, singing in prison while they were in the stocks. Perhaps Peter just needed a singing partner. I don't know if that's what he needed or not, but whatever or wherever he is, he's in a lonely place in his life. And after arresting him, they put him in prison. They handed him over to be guarded. And there he is, not knowing what's going to do. So he's resigned himself. He's gone to sleep. And then the angel appears. And they'd read that. Great. I'm glad you read that like that this morning. Get up, put your clothes on. We're going. And Peter, of course, thought it was just a vision. You know, and this isn't possibly true. We all have these great dreams, don't we? And then he came to himself. And when it dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, mother of John, who also called Mark, where the people had gathered to pray. And of course, he knocks on the door. Rhoda comes to the door, recognizes the voice, possibly her name, and she runs back and tells everyone, and they all think that she's mad. Perhaps it's his angel. They'll start working out who it might be at the door. And he kept knocking, and when they opened the door, he said, look, be quiet. This is what has happened. This is what God has done. You imagine the excitement he's feeling, because it's sinking in now for Peter. Imagine what he was saying. You'll never guess what happened. Remember this story. Tell the brothers, he says, and then he left for another place. And then, of course, afterwards, Herod had made a search for them, and he cross-examined the guards, and then he ordered them executed. It had been 12 years, you know, up to this point. The church was growing at a rate that no one could ever have imagined. The spiritual realm was a reality to these people. They had seen the blind made to see. They'd seen the cripple walk. They'd seen a demonic casted out. They'd seen the dead raised. But they're still having problems believing that the Lord would answer their prayers. What do you think they were praying for in this prayer meeting that opened the prison? What were they praying for? Oh, Lord, we pray you be with Peter. Maybe he'll feel better tomorrow morning. We give him the strength to face the trial, you know, and all the rest of it. Were they praying for his release? But they weren't the only ones. Peter himself thought he was dreaming as well until he's standing in the street. And we can picture that scene of Peter knocking on a door, folk are praying, Rhoda hears a voice and goes back. You see, the trouble is, youngsters believe what they hear. And there's something in this, as the young have no trouble believing. It's just us grown-ups who are cynical and have this reasoning going on, and we have to reason everything out. And that's why they were astonished. Rhoda wasn't astonished. Miracles and perceptions, you see. I read a lovely story this week of a man called Dr. Guthrie, who was a famous Scottish preacher. And there was a bit of a drought going on in Scotland at the time, which is really unusual. And he was in the morning service, and he got the congregation, he said, we're going to pray for rain. And they prayed for rain. And in those days, you used to have 3 services on a Sunday, so morning, afternoon, and evening. And in the afternoon, he was leaving the house, and his daughter caught up with him and said, oh, Dad, you've forgotten this, and gave him his umbrella. And she said, why do I need that? He said, well, you were praying for rain this morning, we might need it. Okay, he says. On the way home, it was a torrential downpour, and he needed his umbrella. Now, here in the passage, this miracle was real. Peter makes his escape, but the cruelty returns as the guards lose their life. And 16 innocent men die because of Herod's stubborn unbelief. Now, I want you to remember this. Herod Agrippa, this man, okay, he was the son of, or the grandson of Herod the Great, was a Jewish king. He was the last Jewish king. He would not and could not believe that God was involved here. He also didn't think of the consequences of his actions beyond his self-interest. And so as the soldiers tell their story, the only explanation that he would accept was that they had betrayed his trust and they were in cahoots with Peter's friends and set him free. So he orders them dead, and that's what they were, killed. Then he went off to his headquarters on the coast. What did I say earlier about pride having the stench of death? So they were baying for his blood. The question was, are secure in chains? Obviously not. But finally, the third heading is free to move on. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this an inspiring story because we see God at work, and it shows us the victory of God over the worldly powers that are in place. But what we haven't considered, and we often don't consider when we read passages like this, is the human cost going on. The real struggle with faith. The pain of grief and the confusion at God's plans when our plans seem that much better. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, had a nickname given to them by Jesus, which was Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Now, one preacher said they probably had leather robes and go faster stripes on their camels. They're the kind of guys that they were. And these two and Peter, they were great friends. And so when James is arrested and then loses his head, that must have shattered them. And then Peter gets arrested too, and more pain is expected. But then Peter is miraculously freed from prison. Now, in the scheme of things, as you're looking on, it doesn't seem to make any sense when we think about all the time and all the effort that Jesus put into these men, preparing them to do a work of ministry. Despite the miracle of Peter being freed and a demonstration that it was the power of God to protect his own, in the background was all of this confusion that these three have been the ones who have been close to Jesus. They had been there when he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. They were the ones who had been with him on the Mount of Transfigurations. They were the ones involved in the founding of the church, the preaching and the teaching and the growing of the church. These were the ones who were the wise ones. Folk must have struggled with these facts, particularly John, I would put to you. Many people here will know of the Mission Aviation Fellowship. Everyone know about Mission Aviation Fellowship? It's the story of Jim Elliott, one of the workers for MAF, and they were reaching out, the team were reaching out to a tribe of Indians in the Amazon. And they had no contact with anyone outside their own group. And eventually they made contact, and they did some amazing stuff, by the way, when they flew in. But they were all killed. All the Christian missionaries were killed. Eventually, many of the tribe became Christians as a result of that effort that was made. But there was a cost to it. But Jim Elliott wrote a very interesting thing in his diary. He said, "He is no fool, the man who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he can never lose." Now, like the circumstances for John, the death of a loved one when others have been spared could well spoil, with the grief and the pain and all the why questions that never seem to be answered are there. See, seeing our life from God's perspective, however, is learning the power to live. For John, we know that he lived for another 50 years and he wrote 5 books of the New Testament. You see, when we put our lives into the hands of God, he enables us to step across the threshold of eternity. Then he closes the door of our past tight shut behind us. And he wants us to hear the sound of that. He wants us to leave all our questions and all our hurts at his feet. He needs us to acknowledge that we just trust him even when we don't have the answers. The problem is we want to go back and I'll help you with that bit. Once we do that, we can experience the fresh start of a walking with God, free to move on. Verse 19, after Herod had a thorough search made for him and he didn't find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. And then Herod went to Judea, to Caesarea, and stayed a while there. He'd been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. They now joined together and sought an audience with him, and after securing support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. Now, on the appointed day, Herod, wearing his robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. And they shouted, "This is the voice of God, not of man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down and he was eaten by worms and died. Oh, I love that. Okay. But the word of the Lord continued to increase. I think it's so funny how it just changes. When Barnabas and Saul finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. So another part of the story is starting. Okay, the king is dead. The wicked king is dead. But actually, there's more to that story. There was nothing that Herod could have ever done or said because he was just a man. But when we look into the history of it, Josephus, who is a man who was a Jewish historian, actually describes this event. And I thought you might like to hear about it. It seems that the audience with Herod Agrippa coincided. There's all the top people from Tyre and Sidon. They knew what side their bread was buttered on. So they were going and asking, can we have some peace now so we can be fed? Okay, but that time actually coincided with a celebration or a series of shows that they were put on. And it was in honor of Caesar. And Caesarea actually is quite a significant name because it's dedicated to Caesar. And it was on the second day of the show that Herod dressed, now this is exactly what Josephus says. He was dressed in a robe made of silver throughout, of quite wonderful weaving, and entered the theatre at break of day. Then the silver shone and glittered wonderfully as the sun's rays fell on it. And its resplendence inspired a sort of fear and trembling in all that gazed upon it. Immediately, his flatterers called out from various directions in a language that boded him no good. For they invoked him as a god, and he did not rebuke them, nor did he repudiate their impious flattery. Now we think that Herod just dropped down dead and died. No, he didn't. Listen to this. A pang of grief pierced his heart. At the same time, he was seized with a severe pain in his bowels, which quickly increased in intensity. He was hastily carried into the palace, and when he had continually suffered for 5 days from pain in his belly, he died in the 54th year of his life and the 7th year of his kingship. It wasn't as easy as all that. That's when he was eaten by worms. You see, those that would be great need to understand that God is not mocked. He has a purpose for the world that is beyond the orders of human beings with all their wealth, with all their celebrity, with all their political power. The reality and the comfort to us is that in spite of the difficulties, despite the pain, despite all the confusion we experience at times, God has got our lives and history in the palm of his hand. And we're going to continue next time. Shall we pray?